Hey there, my name is John Dyer, and I have the privilege of getting to talk to you today a little bit about technology, families, and education. Now, before I jump into this, I just want to show you a picture of me when I was a kid. This isn't actually me, but this is very close to what I looked like. I have always loved computers and playing with them and making things with them and just figuring out what they do. And so all the things I'm going to say today are not necessarily trying to be against technology or that technology is bad, but it's something that is we're at a stage now where we really need a lot of help to know how to contain it. And so even as I developed over the last 10, 15 years, some media player software that's used on StarWars.com, I mean, I love making this stuff, and I love to see the things that I make get used out in other places. I'm also like you, reading the news, and I'm seeing things like these worries about screen time for little kids, and all these different studies that are coming out over and over and over again, wondering what's going on with teens and depression and anxiety and all of these things. And then we're starting to see some new reports out here where, 20 years ago, we sort of thought that the poorest kids would not have access to technology and only rich kids would have access to technology. And it turns out that now the opposite of that is true. That we're seeing that it's the poor districts that are kind of forcing screens on kids, and the richer districts are people who are able to go to private school or those who are able to have a kind of sort of a screen-free education. And then we see that, really directly, this is one of the suits that was brought by 42 state attorney generals against Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram. And this is too long to read on screen, but you'll notice right here in the middle of it, it says the lifetime value of a 13-year-old is about $270. That was as of 2018. And as this goes on, they look at Instagram's design as inherently bad for teenage girls. This is what Facebook and Meta know about their product, Instagram. And so they looked at different studies that would say if they removed the number of likes from posts, that would actually make things a lot better for people. But they realized that would have a 1% negative impact on their profit, and so they decided not to do it. And so we see that the companies that we're working with aren't really looking out for our best interests. And so you're beginning to see, secular philosophers like Jonathan Haidt, who's just saying we have to get these we have to get phones out of schools now for the betterment of our entire country. Because as you see here, they're hurting learning. Kids aren't learning. They're not having good friendships and relationships. And then ultimately, they feel like they don't belong. And so as much as we feel like phones are important to us, there's some issues here. So I want to tell you, I'm right in the middle of this. I've got teenage kids, and they're awesome. This is Benjamin and Rebecca. There's Dr. Amber Dyer, who is a headmaster of a classical education school. She's a fantastic educator and also a professor, but also parenting with me, and she's a researcher in this in her own right. She has presented in this area before too. So we get to work together, but today I've got to present it all myself just for this recording. So we are both doing this in our family, in our own personal lives, and also in education around. So I'm going to give you 5 things that you should know about technology, and then a couple of things that I think are practical about schools and about families. So the first one, I think, as we had all those warning things a minute ago, is just to remind ourselves that technology is a deep part of what it means to be human. All the other creatures that are around, they all have natural things. They have claws and teeth and speed, but we are made in such a way that we are actually able to make other things. And if we think about what's happened, especially over the last about 200 years, these are just 2 simple graphs from our world and data that are showing that the percentage of the world in poverty has gone way down over the last 200 years. And the percent that is literate has gone way, way, way up. And so there's some really positive things that have happened. We also think about just wonderful technologies like this little guy is going to be able to get a cochlear implant that lets him hear his dad's voice. See that just surprise that he heard his voice. It's wonderful. Rosalind Picard up at MIT is using some technology that looks at a person's face and is able to tell their emotions. And the reason for this is not to monetize that, but for her, it's in order to help autistic kids who aren't really able to pick that up with their own natural abilities, but to give them this kind of filling back in of something they didn't have before, so they know what's happening conversationally. At the same time, there are these things like the Surgeon General is saying that our kids are spending 4 to 6 hours a day, and teens are up to 9 hours a day. And this was in 2020 data. This was sort of published right in the middle of the pandemic, so this is before that. And kids that spend more than 3 hours a day are more likely to face this increased risks of depression and anxiety. And then we say all this stuff about most teenagers would say that social media is making them feel worse about their body. And then teens are, like most of us, receiving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of notifications a day, pulling them away from their friends, from just fun things that they might be doing. And so when we start to look at this data, for example, the green line here is the homicide rate over the last about 20 years, and the blue line is the suicide rate for tweens and early teenagers. And if you look, it starts to go up there in the middle, kind of right in this 2007, 2008 period. And we think about that period, there's a whole lot happening, 2007 and 8. There's the subprime mortgage crisis where a lot of people lose their homes. There is the invention of the iPhone in 2007. There's a sort of major political change through 2008 through 2016. All of these things are happening, and we can't, immediately blame any one of those things. But it's hard not to say if iPhones are released at this point, they start getting given to kids, that we would see this, decrease in homicide, that increase in suicide rate. And we look at our broader world as a whole, and this is just sort of looking at the left and right divides in America, the liberal, conservative, the Republican, and Democrats. And look in the 90s, there's a lot of overlap there, even though they fought, but there was some overlap. Even in the early 2000s, there's a lot of overlap. But by the time we get to 2017, there's just this huge polarization. And again, there's all kinds of things happening politically to make that possible. But a lot of that is happening online in that period between 2004 and 2017 with the rise of various social media platforms and also phones in our own homes. And then there's just the funny data that we sometimes we blame kids for all these things. We say, kids and their phones. But when we look at a lot of the data, it would say that the older someone gets, often they're the more likely to pull out their phone during a meal. And it's actually the youngest among us that are the most phone literate in terms of the way that they carry themselves socially in situations where they have phones. So this leads to this question, all of this stuff that I just showed you. I like to ask audiences when I'm in person, is technology good, bad, or neutral? And what I find is that just intuitively, there's a few people that will say good, and there's a few people that will say on the whole it's bad. But intuitively, most people would say, hey, technology is just neutral. All that really matters is how you use it. So I think the second thing you need to know is something that's really, really important, is that technology is good, I think, that it's something that is deeply part of what it means to be human, like we just said, but it's never neutral. And here's what I mean by that. So if we were to say that technology was neutral, we think about an older tool like a shovel, and we just said, this tool is neutral. And we thought about good use, and we think about bad uses for those tools. And we want to do the good things. We don't want to do the bad things, right? But if we think about the process of what happens when we build and when we actually dig that hole, and you think just for a moment about what happens to you when you do that. If you thought about shoveling all day, what would happen to your hands? And then if you thought about what would happen to you if you shoveled, say, every day for a month, what would happen to you? Well, your hands would probably get blisters and calluses, and your body would maybe start to develop some muscle structure. So the thing is that you're going to get changed in the process of using that tool. And so notice the thing that's important about this is that whether you're doing something good or bad, either way, you get this transformative effect happening to you. It doesn't actually matter what your intent was or what the moral outcome of your action is. Either way, just by using that tool repeatedly over time, you get changed. And so, Marshall McLuhan is one of the early 60s thinkers that really put a lot of great language around this stuff that helps us to think about technology. And he would say this, that our normal response to media is that all that matters is how you use it. And he says this is the numb stance of the technological idiot, that if you just care about how it's used, just use it for good and not for bad, you're missing a whole lot of things. This is sort of what I mean by that. And something like an iPhone, we think, well, is it good or bad, Mom? Should I have it or should I not? And we think, well, there's good things that we can do, and there's bad things that we can do with the technology. But that's all we need to do is, as long as we're using it for good, well, then we can give it to a young child, right? If we just tell them to do good things and tell them not to do bad things. But at the very least, if we think about it, when we have a phone with us, my own personal life is that when I go around the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, I never know where I'm going without my phone. In fact, I used to know where I could drive when I was a kid, but now I know less about my spatial surroundings just because I use maps all the time. I no longer have a mind that is able to remember where things are. And then if I think about the idea of being constantly accessible for work or relationships, now all of a sudden, every moment when I'm with someone, I could be with someone else. And every moment when I'm trying to concentrate on a conversation, my phone can be buzzing me in my pocket. So just that presence of the phone, even if I'm only using it for good, changes just my sense of the world, my sense of relationships. That's not to say even all the other things that might happen if I use it for my alarm clock. And then if I use it for my alarm clock, it's the first thing I see in the middle of the day, or at the beginning of the day. And it's likely that I'm going to check a bunch of things that, even if they're not bad, they're just things that are going to reorder my day in a particular way. So again, on McLuhan, he would have this idea that every technology is going to extend some natural part of you, but at the same time, it's going to amputate that same part of you. So if we think about something like a microphone, it extends our voice, but at the same time, it amputates our ability to learn how to project our voice in a powerful way. So we could say the same thing about cars and bicycles, that they extend our legs and our ability to go somewhere, but then we become sedentary, and so we have to invent things like exercise. And so we could do this with every technology. But I think, very, very important early technologies, like here, this looks like she's looking at a phone, but she's actually just looking at a mirror. And a mirror is such a simple technology that shapes how we see ourselves. And so I think what we're trying to get at is this third point, that technology is good. It's part of what it means to be human, but it's never neutral. And because of that, it's always transformative in the way that it operates on us. So when we think about going into a gym, we actually choose these tools based on what we want those tools to do for us. They shape us in one direction or the other. And so if we want long, lean legs, we choose one tool. And if we choose big, strong legs, we want the other one. And we shape ourselves in different directions. In fact, when you go into a gym, there's these little labels on each tool. And it directly tells you this tool will change you in this way. If you use this tool repeatedly, every single day, on a really regular basis, you will be transformed in the using of this particular tool. Then it points out right there what's going to happen. But when we go buy a phone, it doesn't have the same thing on it, right? There's no label here that says that, if you crouch over a phone all day, you're probably going to change the posture of your neck and you're going to have a little bit more of a hunched over look, or it's going to do something to your mind in this way. And it might actually be helpful if we did this at some point. But if we go back to more than 2,500 years ago, Socrates, when he one of the stories that his disciple Plato wrote down in the Phaedrus, is a story about a king who someone invents writing, and so this king is actually really worried about the invention of writing because he says it's going to implant forgetfulness in a person's soul. Because writing is external to your own mind, you're going to cease to remember things, and you're going to not have those things inside themselves, but they're going to be external to you. The same way that I now find that maps have changed my own mind. This was this early worry about what the technology of writing itself would do. So again, they may be writing the highest philosophy, and yet because it's external and not internal in one's own mind, it had this formative power. So when we think about things like the great books that you might read if you went to a kind of a classical education style school, and you total up the number of words of some of these great works, 1.8 million, right? But if you just check a social media platform just a couple of times a day, and you don't have a ton of friends, and they don't write a whole lot, but you do that every single day, that ends up actually being more words than all of those books combined. And so what's happening here is that it's not so much that these two activities can be compared directly in the number of words, but the type of activity, the type of thing that you're doing when you are interacting with these is quite different. Because most of the things on the left require a sustained thought and attention. And most of the things on the right don't really require that. They're each decontextualized. Each post can be read on its own. And in fact, the thing about the activity on the right is that we don't actually read what's on there. That we sort of fling through, and that we scan, that we move, and we go really fast, and that we read parts of images and parts of captions and parts of like counts and all of those things. And it really doesn't matter what the content is. Even if you have peaked your algorithm on Instagram to be only really good things, it's still a very different activity that you're training your mind for. And eventually that begins to change even the way that you view the world and your relationships. So when we think about something like just having a phone and its presence around you, there are a number of studies that would say even if a phone is just sitting on a table, that it sort of tells everyone there that the world outside of them is more important than them. And so multiple psychologists would say if you really want to have a deep and close connected relationship, then you need to have all those things out of sight, not just on the table, out of your pocket, not somewhere you can't use them, but they need to be out of the way so that they're not buzzing you in your pocket and that no one can see them if you want to build this kind of deep relationship. So all this leads us to our fourth point, which is that modern devices are built in such a way, and modern apps, all of this whole ecosystem, are built in such a way that they are grabbing for your attention. So here's what I mean by this. This is what I would call inefficiency optimization. So when we look at this jackpot machine here on the left, you see that you pull the lever and it has a bunch of things that move, and then you see three things appear. Now, if I was a programmer and I was trying to make this absolutely efficient, as soon as you pull the lever, all three things would appear at once. But instead of doing that, this is designed to be inefficient, and that it shows you one thing at a time, and it shows you this whole spinning motion, and then 1, 2, 3. The reason for that is that each of those motions is something that creates excitement in you and really urges you to want to pull it again. If you pulled it and just immediately showed you three things, it wouldn't be as exciting as that rotation 1, 2, 3. Well, Instagram uses the same type of inefficiency. So, when you open up Instagram, and it looks a little bit different today, but it's going to show you a whole lot of things here. And it's going to wait a couple of seconds. So instead of being absolutely efficient and showing you everything all at once, it waits a few seconds, and then it shows you things like a like count and a friend count. And this is now up in the top, but it shows you that after a couple of seconds. And then a couple of seconds later, it's going to show you a new set of things, which might be an ad for a couch that you might need to like. But the point is that these things are each firing something that is keeping your attention and keeping you excited while you're using this app. And what they're taking advantage of is these two different types of ways that your brain operates. So there's two different sets of things that can happen in your brain. On the one side, dopamine can release that gives you this sense of pleasure. On the other side, serotonin can give you this sense of joy. And the way that you might illustrate this is that when dopamine is hit, it's this kind of feeling of goodness that makes you want more. Whereas when joy hits or serotonin hits, it feels good, but you feel more of a sense of closure or satisfaction. So dopamine might be like eating a cookie and then you want another cookie. Whereas serotonin might be like you gave somebody a hug, you feel good, but you don't want to hug them a second time because that would be awkward, right? So the way this dopamine loop works when you're using technology is that maybe, let's say, you're playing a video game, and killing monsters is kind of fun. It releases a little bit of something, but the way it now works is that you get a set of rewards for that. That might be points, but often there are points that you can do something with, like buy weapons. The thing is that if you don't get enough points, then that dopamine release is great, but there's a little bit of a gap there in terms of the number of rewards you had and the type of weapon that you need to buy. So the way that this can work is at this point right here is to sell you coins. So you could keep playing it, and that would give you some form of dopamine release, but in order to play kind of the newer, cooler enemies, you need to get more rewards or you need to pay for them. And so that little point of selling coins is taking advantage of this dopamine release and desire for more. The same thing happens with social media in a sense that when you use it, you're performing some type of action like posting something. And then you're usually receiving some type of reaction to those things like likes. And then that releases a dopamine set that makes you want to do the same thing again. The catch is that oftentimes if you're feeling a little bit down, or maybe just it's like, man, I just feel alone, then you might feel sad. And so you might use social media. And the best place for someone to come in and make money is in this moment between posting and receiving any type of feedback. So that's that moment where an ad makes a lot of sense for you to be able to monetize that application. So we saw earlier that the lifetime average of a 13-year-old is $270. The whole thing is using this system to figure out how you can maximize this. And even a feature that might say reduce the number of focusing on likes, that might only lose 1% for a company, but that 1% is something they're not willing to do. And so they're going to always choose maximum profits over what would be something that would maybe be good for humans or teenagers, or both. So that brings us to our last point, is that technology needs virtue. So one perspective might be to just burn it all to the ground, but I think this is why we need something internal to our own self. Because there's a bunch of ethical challenges. There's a whole surveillance culture coming. There's biological enhancement coming. There's data privacy. There's an energy crisis. What I might even say, of course, around all of this is artificial intelligence. What is really okay to use? And we need good thinkers to be able to answer these questions. People who are not just motivated by profit, although profit is good and something that we should be doing, and we should engage in activities that are helpful to society and to ourselves, but maximizing profits alone does not really make a good society. And so I think someone like Mark Cuban here in the Dallas area is going to say, hey, I think we need more liberal arts majors than programming majors. And the reason he's saying that is that when you're actually thinking about solving real problems, not just making a thing, not just writing code, but when you're thinking about solving something that's really, really difficult, you need that internal resource that a really good education can give you. And so, when you're sitting here with the phone, the question usually is, what do I use it for? And I've been encouraging you to think about how does it shape me, but what we haven't really been asking is this question of what is life actually about? What is it for? What is education for? Is it just to get a degree, to get a job? Or is there something deeper that it needs to be doing? So in this last part, what I want to do is think a little bit about technology in the family, and then also think about technology in education. So one thing I think just for families I think is always helpful is that, there was some early talk maybe 10, 15 years ago about how much screen time someone was getting. Were you on for X number of hours or not? And I think it's great for, when you're talking to initial kids, just to be thinking about some categories. So one of these is the difference between, am I mostly creating with this tool, or am I mostly consuming with this tool? So when I talk with my own kids, I would say things like, hey, screens are really for making. They're something that we've been given to do something else with. And so it's okay if you want to spend some time painting or doing something like that on a device, but if you just want to watch another show, then we're not going to use it right now. And then when it does come to consumption, there's this category of, is this something that's actually somehow enriching me? Maybe it's cooking, baking, coding, something like that, learning something, versus just purely entertainment. This is not to say that entertainment is ever purely bad. It's just, again, to think about the categories of what am I doing. And then when I'm doing any of these things, is this something that I can do with another person? So maybe I'm playing video games, but I'm actually playing it right next to another person? Or is this just something that I'm totally doing by myself? So again, the things on the right are not inherently bad, but if we only spend time on that right side and never any of the things on the left, then we're probably having an impoverished way of using screens. And the thing that parents always want to know is, what should I give kids and when? And I can't tell you the exact rules. I am not here to be your parent and to tell you exactly what you should do. But I do see some guidelines that have been appearing around that there's starting to be more and more consensus around. And so say this first off is that, the American Academy of Pediatrics would say something like this: from 0 to 2, there really should be no screen time. And from 2 to 6, before kids are going to school, they really should have no more than an hour per day. Now, in general, with the first child, this is pretty easy because they don't know about screens yet. And so, but as soon as you begin to introduce them, you find that kids really want them more and more and more. And the more kids you have, the harder this becomes. But this is the general framework of what is really thought to be helpful, that all of the systems that are out there that are selling you something about teaching your kids to read when they're really, really young, one, they don't really work, and two, they're not really necessary. It's totally okay for a kid not to learn how to read until they're in kindergarten. Now, maybe they learn their alphabet and those things, but they really don't need to learn all those things. And they certainly don't need screens to learn how to do those things. And I think the rest of this time when it comes to what we're going to do with entertainment is to teach kids to be responsible in sort of a progressive way over time. I think when it comes to the internet or apps, maybe we might start to think about, as kids are getting to an age where they're really understanding these things, is to really emphasize things that are creative. Again, things that are painting, that are making, that are puzzle solving, not so much things that are just consumption of shows or video games or those types of things, but things where someone's actually able to make things. And as kids get older, and really the whole way, is to make sure there's some filters on the devices. The truth is that you're never going to prevent all bad things from coming into your house, or from your kids of seeing all bad things just in life. But we can have a certain level of protection there that is not just all open all the time. Now, the really, really hard one, I think, is the phone and text one. And the reason why I have a little gradient here is that, there's a variety of different views on this. Some people would say wait until the very, very end of high school. Some people are as early as middle school or even into elementary school. And so I've got this little movement here. My point is that in this zone of, sort of 10 to 16, we're really thinking a lot about how do we make sure that we're not just saying, here's an entire smartphone, do whatever you want with it with nothing on it. What we're wanting to do is be a lot more progressive in that way. And that you might think that you may have a child that is in middle school and needs to have some type of communication device. Well, that doesn't have to be a fully fledged smartphone. It can be something that doesn't have an internet browser. It doesn't have social media on it. But over time, though, we do also want to be thinking about when our kids are 18 and they're leaving the home, they should have some experience that you've taught them before they leave. So this is sort of like when we think about driver's ed and learning to drive a car, that, this is a progressive thing. At 15, you get a permit, and at 16 you get a license, but you can only have one friend, and at 17 you get more privileges. That we're trying to do the same thing with phones and texting. And with social media, almost the entire consensus of all scholars, of all tech users, of almost anybody, is that kids don't have any type of social media until at the very, 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 very youngest at 16. And so even then it would be very much guided. So Laurie Santos works at Yale University. She runs a happiness podcast. That's all kinds of great things, not tech related at all. But her really conclusion about when a kid should get a phone is as long as possible is what you want to be doing. The earlier you do, the more likely it is to have, there's more bad than there is good there. And that if you do it, that you want to do it in a progressive and slow way. Now, my own family, what we decided to do is to say sort of a limited smartphone in high school was the way that we would go. And we decided to make a little phone contract. And the first part of it is really some positive things, some things that we want to think about what phones are, and that they're part of our modern world, and we want to learn to use them responsibly. We also believe that there is a God who made us and who made our ability to be responsible creators, that this is a really good thing and good part of our humanity. And yet we also want to know that everything is tracked and that someone out there is trying to help me live in unhealthy ways, and that companies do not have my best interest in mind. And so we have a whole set of things that we want to think through on that. Some things that I think are all good for all families to know is that if you do have some type of home internet, that you put in some type of security and filtering for every device in your home. The stock applications, the stock phones are just not, they just don't have enough there. Apple and Android all have some level of filtering on them, but I think you want to do this at the level of the router. And so there's some products out there. I'm mentioning two here, Griffin Router and Circle Router. Both have a set of parental controls, but also just general filters that have a lot to do with malware and all of that can prevent a lot of things from coming into your house. So I think just doing that basic level of protecting there is good, so that if you have an iPad at home, that internet connection is filtered through something other than just the iPad's controls. Then when it comes to the age of actually having individual devices, there's a whole lot of things that aren't just here's a smartphone. There are a variety of different types of dumb phones. You may have heard of a Gabb phone. There's a great company called Techless that's trying to make a healthy phone that only has apps that are really useful for things like maps, but doesn't have a lot of other things that might just the kinds of things that we all find ourselves wasting our time with. And then some parents decide that they want to do things like just have a watch, so it can text and can track, but it really can't do all of the things that a phone can do, and that makes them feel like that kid can be connected. At the same time, there's a lot of great software applications out there that can be installed on the devices, both phones, iPads, computers, desktops, laptops, all that sort of thing, that allow another layer of filtering on there that a little bit makes the router a little bit less necessary. But again, having it on the router is really helpful for when a friend brings over a device, that also does a level of filtering there that you can't sort of control with that software. Most of these things like Bark and Canopy and Custodio, they're all about $100 per year. They're not that expensive. The routers are not that much more expensive than a regular router, other than just what you would have from your home internet provider. So these are just some basic things that would help protect your home. And I would say just for yourself, one more thing is that in general, almost all of us should turn off all the notifications. There are really very few things other than emergency contacts from our spouse or maybe our boss. We really don't need anything else. We don't need it from shopping apps. We just don't need it at all. Those are the types of things that really take away from the good life. And so if you go in there and you turn all of those off, that will end up being a lot better for you. Most of the newer phones have great things like they can do afternoon summaries or other versions of notifications that you're not getting them throughout the day. There's just a couple of general guidelines I think that can be helpful for kids, but also for adults, because kids are looking to us to see how we actually do things, what we say, and then what we actually do. And so these are also things that can help us in our own life. So lastly, technology and education, what we've been talking about is in some ways pull the phones out of school. But there is some data out there that would indicate that there are good technologies to use in schools, that when you put a data projector in a classroom, that it can really increase the grades. But that when you have a lot of other devices, mostly tablets and laptops and those types of things, you'd even think that e-readers would be helpful. But for the most part, they seem to be degrading school and grades. And that most of the research is saying they just really aren't that helpful. That learning to read, learning to do math, all of those things are better on paper, on whiteboards and that sorts of thing, and manipulatables. Those are always going to be better than screens. So I would just say, too, when we think about education as a whole, there's this big concern about STEM education. And I would say that there's sort of this sense of true STEM and fake STEM, and then the liberal arts that I would make a case for at the end. What I mean by true STEM, this is science, technology, engineering, and math, is that they really do have a good formal training in programming and engineering, and that parents are responsible for really filling in the gaps when it comes to critical thinking, ethics, and humanity. So if you send your kid to a true STEM school, You may be getting some of this really neat things with robotics, but you're going to have to fill in the meaning behind all those things. The problem, I think, is that there's a lot of schools that are doing what I would call fake STEM, which is basically just give a kid a device and then hope that they learn how to do all these things. And so they're giving the kid the device with the hopes that, just having them will help them with, math and reading basic skills, but that just being in the presence of technology will somehow make them be great business leaders and great coders. The problem is that the people who make those things did not grow up with those things. And so those are not necessary in order for you to become the greatest coder in the world or to become the greatest business person in the world. You did not need to have those growing up, that you can get those much, much, much later. In fact, I was recently spending some time with some friends who work for Amazon, and they were saying that they need more coders. So they came up with a 9-month coding camp. And in that 9-month coding camp, they could take a person who was a driver who'd never coded before, take them from zero to being an Amazon coder in 9 months. What that says to me is that you don't need all this stuff when you're in elementary, middle school, and high school. What you need is deep formation. This is why I would be a big fan of the liberal arts, to focus on these questions of what it means to be human. What is beauty? What's justice? What's truth? To think about good scientifically validated technology like projectors and paper books, and then to learn programming later, because really that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is learning what it means to be human. And so when we think about this idea of that an iPad is so easy that a baby can use it. We don't want babies running society. And so what we want to do is not give these things immediately to our kids and not give them immediately in our schools, but to do them in a progressive way that helps kids, just like we would do with a car, to learn them over time, to take in the value of that technology is good, but it's always formative for us. And that sometimes the people who are using them don't have our best interests in mind. And that's why we want to create a good and safe environment in our homes and in our families. Hope that was helpful.